everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for the 9th of December, where we are in the midst of talking about The Exorcist. And I began last class by talking about the movie, which was nothing short of a cultural phenomenon. And I asked you to watch a piece of the movie, stopping right before the movie begins to get graphic. Now, as you are reading the novel, because you know watching a movie is never a substitute for the novel is quite graphic as well. And in terms of how to proceed with that, if you're feeling uncomfortable, what I suggest is that you skim those pages, and you won't sacrifice much in terms of the content of the plot. This film and this text, I think, uses what Stephen King talks about in relation to the gross out factor, and that it tries very much to shock the audience by being as vulgar as possible. And I've always maintained that this text and this film have been completely misunderstood. The focus, and it's because of its graphic nature, has been on Regan MacNeil, the girl who is possessed. But just look at the title of the novel and look at the title of the film, and it's about The Exorcist. And if we were to read the text and view the film from that perspective, it's a very different story. And in fact, we have two exorcists. The first we're introduced to at the very beginning of the novel, and that happens to be Father Merrin. And then later on, we're introduced to Father Karras. I know that individuals watching the film oftentimes said that they were a bit disoriented and a bit confused by the way The Exorcist opened, which happened to be in a dig in Iraq, an archaeological dig with Father Merrin. And he is basically introduced later on in the novel. He meets up with the Father Karras, and then they go to defeat the demon. The idea is that that dig is in Iraq, which, according to folklore, is viewed as the location of the original Garden of Eden, and a place that will never have peace, because it's where the fall of man occurred. And when we are introduced to Father Merrin, and then later on in the novel we learn more about him, we find out that he's a man of religion, but he's also a man of science. He's an archaeologist. We've seen this before in other horror films, a kind of Van Helsing figure in Dracula, if you will, and also in other horror texts, such as Dracula, where the idea is that the person who can straddle both worlds successfully is the one that ultimately is going to be able to defeat evil. Now, the film is loosely based on documented exorcisms. There are several throughout the course of history, beginning actually with some biblical exorcisms, and those are referenced within the text, right down to approximately 15 years ago or so, where there was a newspaper article where Pope John Paul performed at least the beginnings of an exorcism. Part of the story that makes it interesting from our perspective is the ambiguity that's embedded within it. In that, yes, this could be a true supernatural phenomenon, but it can also be a physiological or a psychological phenomenon. And for those of you who decide to see the rest of the film, and this will be optional for this particular class, you can begin with minute 31 and 22 seconds, which is where I had you stop last class. And you can continue on to hour 2, 8 minutes and 16 seconds to be exact. The film that I was able to find access to is the longer version, not what was originally shown. It's about 15 minutes longer or so. It includes a scene that I think is central to the film. If you haven't read the text, it might be a bit unclear in watching the film. And this is where Father Damien and Father Karras are talking about the whole point of possession, which is not to torment the possessed, but to torment those individuals around the possessed. So I think that's an important scene. There's also a scene called the Spider Walk, where we see Regan basically walk backwards on all fours down a staircase. Censors actually deleted that scene as saying that it was too taboo and too disturbing for audiences, though they were able to leave many other disturbing scenes in place. So I'm not so sure what makes that scene worse than some of the other scenes that were in there. Actually, they used a contortionist to film that scene. Obviously, they didn't have the CGI that we've got today, but I think the special effects have held up fairly well considering the age and the very famous Linda Blair. Linda Blair is the actress who plays Regan MacNeil. The very famous head that turns all the way around on the neck is actually in the Smithsonian Museum. But we were talking about the violation of taboos over the course of this semester with the text that we've been reading, and definitely this text can be read from that perspective. And oftentimes it's read as a commentary on the turmoil of the 1970s, a time of campus protests. It's no coincidence that Chris MacNeil, and notice how Chris sounds like Christ, that Chris MacNeil actually is filming a movie about campus protests. It's a time of drugs and Vietnam with a lot of youths that seemed completely unrecognizable to adults. They seemed almost like they were monsters, or for lack of a better explanation, almost possessed. And I think if we view the text from that particular perspective, especially since the 1970s was such a tumultuous time, we get Chris, who is a single mother, which at the time would have raised some eyebrows. She is an actress, and basically what that means is that she lies for a living. And it's in Washington, D.C., and as I like to joke, but it's only a half joke, that if you're going to find a new locale for evil, a modern locale for evil, nothing would perhaps work better than Washington, D.C. itself. It was also a time when religion was being questioned. Chris and her family are atheists. And we also see this huge discrepancy between wealth and poverty in the film that I think is quite interesting. The Ouija board that we had talked about a little bit with the haunting will make an appearance again in this particular text. The idea is that perhaps the use of the Ouija board opens up a portal. But again, there are lots of psychological explanations as well as to how Ouija boards work. Perhaps they are controlled subconsciously by the user, and that would happen to be Regan MacNeil. And as much as she is tormented, and certainly she's quite upset about the divorce of her parents, certainly she's a young girl on the cusp of puberty, which makes her a prime candidate for poltergeist activity. We have other characters who are tortured by their own demons, whether it be Bert Demings and alcohol, whether it be Chris MacNeil and her guilt that she's chosen her career over her family, which again in the 1970s was definitely an issue for female, the idea of choosing one over the other rather than being able to successfully negotiate both. We definitely have a father, Karras, who is tormented with his own guilt about his mother and the poverty life, or the poverty-stricken life that she's forced to lead because he's chosen the priesthood, and his struggle with his loss of faith, which perhaps could be said the prime prize for a devil figure is to get a fallen priest. And even Father Merrin in the text, it's discussed much more so in the film, his arrogance and that he's chosen a life of academic study rather than giving himself up to the poor. So all of that is embedded within the text. And one of the things you can't see, I think even in that small snippet of the movie, but definitely it's also referenced in the book as well, are all of the references to doors, something that we saw with Jekyll and Hyde as well. Doors are oftentimes entryways into the psyche. And the evil of wealth and poverty is just one of the many evils that happen to be examined in this particular text. Whether or not it turns out that this is some sort of a physiological phenomenon, and many people have said that in reading the book and watching the film in particular, the most horrific scenes have been some of the medical scenes. Whether it be psychological, and there definitely is a good amount of psychological torment, not just with Regan MacNeil, but those who surround her. Whether it be paranormal or poltergeist activity, much like we talked about with Ellie and The Haunting of Hill House as a possibility, or whether it be actually supernatural and that demon Pazuzu that we are introduced to in The Dig with Iraq. And also the possibility that multiples can be true at the same time. Just like we talked about with The Haunting, that it's quite possible that Ellie is mentally disturbed and the house is haunted as well. So What I'm going to do is allow you to watch the second part of the movie if you so decide to. If you decide that it's too graphic for you, then your assignment is to finish reading the text, which we will put closure to next week, which happens to be the last week of our semester. So we'll continue to talk about The Exorcist and how it works within the genre of Gothic literature. And again, if you're reading the text and you come across a passage that's just too graphic for your taste, skim through it and get past it. Usually they last about a half a page to a page and a half, and then you can move on from there. I also wanted to ask you to answer the English department assessment question. If you haven't already done so, thank you for all of you who have answered that question. Please send your answer to my email. And again, the English department is trying to gather data about how to improve its courses. And the question, which you can see indicated at the bottom of our notes, is that English 101 at GCC is designed to prepare students for college-level reading, writing, and research challenges across all disciplines at the college. What skills, knowledge, and/or resources were you introduced to, or did you practice in English 101 that you find to be particularly useful now? Are there areas you wish had been covered in more depth in your English 101 class? And for today's attendance question, which will be due Thursday, the 10th of December at 8 a.m., is why do you think most individuals focus on the possessed girl, Regan, rather than the exorcists, Marin and Karis, in The Exorcist? And that's for both the film as well as the text itself. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I guess you can enjoy, I don't know if I'm using necessarily the right word, but at least you can appreciate why some of the hysteria occurred with the film The Exorcist if you decide to see it in its entirety. Take care. Bye-bye.